Good morning. Welcome to our webinar, How Do You Win in Tough Times? I'm Jim Mintert, Director of the Purdue Center for Commercial Agriculture, and with me today is our Associate Director, Michael Langemeyer, and Purdue Extension Economist. Bruce Erickson and Michael Bolge had planned to be with us, but neither one of them were able to be here this morning because of illness. So we did collaborate on this webinar, so we have their input with respect to content, but unfortunately they're not able to be here this morning. As we go through the course of the webinar, if you have a question, I would encourage you to send that question to my email address here at Purdue, jmintert@purdue.edu. That's the address on your screen. And I will be monitoring that during the course of the webinar, and we'll address those questions towards the end of the webinar. So if something comes up that you want to pursue in a little more detail, I encourage you to send us an email and we'll respond here on the webinar. And if we run out of time and aren't able to do that, we'll try and respond to you by email directly during the course of the day, or perhaps over the next couple of days. So with that, let's kind of kick things off a little bit. And this is a continuation of a discussion that we've been engaged in the last couple of webinars that we've offered here at Purdue. And really, I wanted to maybe tie back a little bit towards what we talked about last time. And last time we talked about improving your farm's management with several different management strategy categories to think about. And we broke it down into really 5 buckets: financial, input purchasing, execution, marketing strategies, and then government programs and crop insurance. And we've offered one webinar focused entirely on government programs. Last webinar really focused on pretty heavily on the financial side with some discussion of input purchasing and some marketing strategies. Today we want to focus primarily on input purchasing and execution and a little less on the financial side, and really do it from the standpoint of encouraging you to become best in class. And by best in class, we really mean, how do you go about becoming one of the leading firms in the industry? How can you adopt a set of strategies that will help you become the most efficient, the most effective farm, certainly in your community, and then from a broader context, perhaps in the industry. And if you do that, that really is going to put you in a position to not only survive what could be a challenging couple of years for many crop farms, particularly in the Midwest, but actually thrive in that kind of an environment. So with that introduction, let's talk a little bit about the fundamental premise. We really want you to become best in class, which is more than just being a low-cost producer. We talk about being a low-cost producer all the time. This is going a little bit beyond that in the sense of identifying some strategies that you can use to actually become one of the leading firms in the industry, which is more than just being a low-cost producer. So, Michael, let's talk a little bit about strategy here.
Yeah, as you indicated, Jim, a lot of producers focus on being a low-cost producer. What does that mean? Typically, we're talking about low cost per bushel or per unit of output. If you're a livestock producer, it'd be per pound produced. And so that's what we're talking about. We're talking about low cost. A lot of producers have focused on that. But there's also some other strategies you need to think about in times like this. One of those is the second one here, customer-centric. Ask what your buyer wants and try to provide that. And so that may be producing a unique product. Maybe that's producing popcorn, seed soybeans, these kinds of things. That also leads us to the third one here, innovator, first mover. Think about producing different products. Is there some incremental revenue above incremental cost that you could obtain if you produce seed soybeans, for example, or if you produce popcorn, for example? In Indiana, there's a lot of opportunities related to producing new products that are not necessarily commodity based. And so those are some definite things to look at in addition to managing your costs.
And one of the things we talked about before the webinar, Michael, was the fact that if you move into producing some of these specialty products or specialty crops, one of the things you often find out is that you've got to follow a very strict set of protocols, and there can be some spillover impacts to the rest of your business, because following those strict protocols can in fact make you not only a good producer of that specialty crop, but actually can encourage you to adopt some procedures that will actually make you a more efficient and a more effective manager on the rest of your operation as well.
That's typically the case. Typically, when you're producing these specialty crops, you have some standard operating procedures that you have to follow. Having followed those with the specialty crop, usually you tend to start using standard operating procedures on your commodity product, and so that's definitely the case. And some other new products that might be available to some people is vegetable production. The main thing here is to think outside the box. Think a little bit beyond just being a low-cost producer. Is there something you could produce, that's more of a niche market, if you will, or more of a specialty market where you could increase your profit?
So let's talk about some elements of best in class, and a couple of things that come out obviously are some really intense cost control. We talk always about being a low-cost producer, but if you're going to be best in class, you've really got to step it up a notch and think about becoming even more efficient and really examining your productivity on your operation relative to competing firms, first of all in your community, in your part of the state, but actually from a broader context, looking at it from more of an industry perspective. And that means you've really got to know your cost per bushel, not just in the aggregate, which is obviously important, but know component by component, identify those key cost components and know your cost per bushel on each one of those, and then start looking at some ways to perhaps reduce that cost per bushel and make yourself even more efficient.
Yeah, if you're going to improve efficiency, you have to know your cost of production, because how do you know what improvements you need to make if you don't even know whether you're competitive with the current practices that you're using? Maybe when you figure your cost of production, you figure out that you're doing a very good job, and so maybe on a particular crop, but another crop you're not. Maybe soybeans you're a relatively high cost producer, and corn you're a very efficient producer, and so you have to know these costs of production by commodity in addition to having a accrual income statement. I do want to point out it is important to have a very good set of whole farm records, a balance sheet, accrual income statement, cash flow. That's the place to start. Once you have those things, then you need to have basically a production budget for each crop. What is your revenue for corn? What is your revenue for soybeans? What are your individual production costs for fertilizer, seed, cash rent, and all the other costs that we're going to talk about here in a little bit? Knowing those production costs is so important, because you really can't gauge on whether you're making progress if you don't know your production costs and then trace out what is the result of changing your operation. How does that impact your production cost? Know your margins. That's also very important. Some margins that we talk about in our crop guides are contribution margin, which is revenue above operating costs or variable costs. That's always positive in agriculture for most people. You're going to be able to cover variable costs. What you're not going to be able to cover, and we'll see a slide of that here in a little bit, is all costs. Typically the costs that are difficult to cover with $4 corn, for example, are your overhead costs, your costs associated with machinery ownership, your costs associated with land and labor costs. But the important thing here is to know what these margins are so you can gauge whether you're making positive improvements.
That's exactly right. So let's take a look at some of the data, Michael, and you've put together some data based largely on a simulated farm in west central Indiana, actually based on a case farm that you developed that's really modeled after an operation or an average operation in White County, Indiana.
Yes. Like Jim said, this is a simulated case farm based on some yields in White County. This farm has both corn and soybeans. Here we're going to focus on corn. It's very important to know your break-even price to cover variable costs and total costs. And so let's look at this a little bit on this slide. First of all, before I get too much further here, Jim, 12 looks really odd. That's because you got to remember here we had about 110 bushel corn when the trend adjusted yield in White County is 170, 175. And so that's why the break-even prices were really high in 12. Let's focus on 13 and 14 there. If you look at the break-even to cover variable costs, that's relatively low. Even in today's environment, it's roughly $2.50. And so you're going to be able to cover your variable costs, but you have to. In order to produce corn or soybeans or anything, you have to be able to cover these variable costs, and that's typically the case. However, it is more difficult to cover all these costs because you take your variable costs and you add the overhead costs associated with labor, land, and machinery ownership to that, and we're looking at a break-even of $4.50. Obviously in 14 and probably 15, we're probably not going to break even with all costs looking at projected corn prices. And so, but the important point I want to make here is this is just an example. How do you compare to this? Is your break-even price for corn $4 or $5? That makes a lot of difference in how you think about changes in your operation.
And maybe backing it up a little bit, is your break-even $4 or $4.25 or $4.50?
Yes.
So in other words, we often see some incremental changes as you move from operation to from one operation to another, and this is an environment where the ability to reduce those production costs per bushel of output by 20, 25 cents a bushel is going to be very, very important going forward. So for many cases, it's not going to be a huge change from any individual practice, but as you start looking at becoming best in class across a broader spectrum, it could have a very significant impact on your total cost of production and your variable cost of production.
Definitely, and if you want to be able to calculate these variable costs and total costs, I would suggest you look at budgets in the particular state you're in. For Indiana, we do have a crop guide that's on the center's website, Center for Commercial Agriculture website, that you can take a look at so you can see what costs we're including in variable costs and total costs, and then try to do your own calculations.
And start looking for some differences. A lot of times I think individuals will take those stylized budgets, whether they're from Purdue or from perhaps another land-grant university, and treat those as their cost. Our point is to compare your cost to other costs. That means you got to do your own computations and figure out your own variable cost of production and your own total cost of production. That's how you're going to be able to make improvements.
And some of the costs, it's relatively easy to be able to calculate the cost of production. Other costs are more difficult. For example, labor and machinery ownership costs. If you haven't done that before, that takes a little time to estimate those costs. But once you calculate those costs, it's really easy to update them.
Yeah, good point. So let's take a look at net returns, and this slide, Michael, goes back to 2000. Again, looking at the Case Farm here from West Central Indiana.
We actually have the simulated returns going back to 1973, and so let me talk about the 1980s a little bit. If we looked at the 1980s, obviously we'd see 2-3 years that were below zero, but not any more than that. We had if you look at the 1980s, we had 2-3 years below zero here, or below break even, covering all costs, if you will. Notice we've had that also in the early 2000s. We had 3 years in a row there, 2003, 2004, and 2005, where we were not covering all of our overhead costs. That's essentially what that tells us when you're below zero. So that kind of gives us a lead-in of what's happening to 14 and 15 here. Again, these are simulated returns, but we're looking at a loss of about $100 per acre in 14, and 15 is probably going to be similar to that. And so you're looking at a couple years in a row here where you're not able to cover all of your costs.
So let's back up for just a second, Michael. We covered this earlier, but I think it'd be useful to define again for our viewers what we mean by the word or term contribution margin.
The contribution margin is revenue over variable costs, and so that's why those bars are all positive. Break-even price to cover variable costs is $2.50, and so corn prices were above $2.50, particularly in the last 6 or 7 years. They were considerably above that, so that's why the contribution margins are fairly strong there. Another point we want to make here, if you look at 2007 to 2013, notice that those red triangles are pretty high on those bars. And the point I want to make here, and we've talked about this at many different meetings, Jim, is the 2007 to 2013 period is an outlier, if you will. Those are extremely good years for agriculture. Typically, over a long period of time, you expect that little red triangle to gravitate towards zero.
So, in other words, if you think looking at this chart, the time frame from about 2000 to 2005 would be more typical from the long-term time frame. Maybe not a 50-50 split between the break-even and some falling below into the negative territory there. But nevertheless, that's a lot closer to the norm than what we saw the last few years. And from a management standpoint, that means we need to get ready for a return to that kind of an economic environment the next 5 years or so.
We need to think about what costs to focus on and what changes we need to make to get that little red triangle to move towards zero.
Exactly. So let's look at corn production cost, and this again from the Case Farm. We've broken it down into some broad categories to identify the big buckets here.
What I've identified here is the big five. I call them the big five. land is roughly a third of total production cost, fertilizer 20%, seed 14%. Seed has increased a little bit in the last 10 years because of the improvements in varieties with biotech seed, but it's roughly 14% if we look at 2014. In this diagram, machinery is 8%. It's very important to point out, Jim, that this is machinery ownership. So this is the interest and depreciation on your machinery. That's approximately 8%. If we added repairs and fuel to that, which a lot of people do, that machinery pie would be about 13%. So it'd be similar to seed. Labor is also a cost that many people need to look at. That's approximately 5%. So the other includes interest, miscellaneous, crop insurance. Currently repairs and fuel are in the other, and so there's a lot of different things in the other. But if you want to start looking at what costs we need to think about controlling or trying to reduce these costs per bushel, I would start with the big five.
So that gives you a slice or a point in time in terms of how important those are. Let's look at it from more of a longer term standpoint. So now we've taken land cost per bushel of output, going back on this same case farm back to 2000.
In west central Indiana, if you look at cash rent per acre, I'll start with per acre, it's essentially tripled since 2000. If you look at it on a per bushel basis, it's doubled. And so remember, land cost is approximately a third of total production cost, which is a little higher than it was 5 years ago and 10 years ago. And this diagram shows that too. That's a place to start. Is it possible to reduce our cash rent? Maybe that's a place to start thinking about reducing costs on a per acre and per bushel basis, looking at cash rent.
Now you've done a lot of work with this over the years and looked at this from a longer term standpoint. And looking at the chart, it looks like we need to reduce that land cost per bushel of output, perhaps get it back closer to the levels we saw in the early 2000s, certainly in the ballpark of maybe $1 a bushel.
Yes.
But that's not going to happen overnight, and it's not going to happen here in 2015, is it?
Yeah, at some of our webinars and in our meetings, we've been talking about perhaps cash rent backing off 25 to 30%. That would take us from the $1.50 we're seeing here in 13 and 14 back to around about $1, which is still a little higher than where we were from 2000 to 2006 there, but it's a little closer. But again, that's not going to happen overnight. Maybe a 3 to 5 year period. We would expect reductions back to that $1 per bushel over a 3 to 5 year period.
And you've actually built some models to try and explain how rapidly that might occur. And why don't you share that with us with respect to about how much you might expect to see happen in a 1 year period?
Yeah, cash rents and land values don't adjust overnight, and so if you take that 25 to 30% over a 3 year period, you could expect maybe a 5 to 10% over the next 3 years. Because you're not going to get that 25 to 30% in the next year. Yeah,
so the key is we would expect to see some reductions take place. What we've been hearing this winter is we're not going to see a lot of reductions take place in 2015, but we're setting the stage for reductions down the road. But I think that means we need to look to some other areas of our cost structure in terms of maybe making some improvements.
We started with land because it's the biggest cost. Let's look at some costs that we also need to think about. This is a graph of fertilizer cost per bushel of corn in west central Indiana again, and you can see here that 13 and 14, again ignore 12 because that's a result of the low yield. You can see here in 13 and 14 we're looking at about 90 cents per bushel. That's a lot higher than what it was from 2000 to 2006. Again, the pre-ethanol period, and so we're probably going to have to think about: is there something we can do with fertilizer, to kind of reduce that cost per bushel? So we need to think about whether what we're currently doing is the optimum, is the optimum level of fertilizer that we need in terms of N, P, and K.
And so looking at the chart, the reason we saw that bump from where we were running what, roughly 40 cents per bushel of output from 2000 to roughly 2005. More recently, we've been up over 80 cents here, maybe 85 cents the last couple of years. That's largely coming out of the fact that fertilizer prices are substantially higher today than they were in the early 2000s,
yes,
right?
There's two factors going on here. One is the fertilizer prices, and certainly in 2008, that's what's going on. Relatively high fertilizer prices in 2008. The other thing here is we have to remember that yields are quite a bit higher. Our trend yield is quite a bit higher in 14 and 15 than it was in 2000. So because of that, because we're shooting for a higher yield, we're going to use more fertilizer, and so that's also playing in this graph.
So one of the things that drives fertilizer prices is the derived demand for fertilizer. And when crop prices are high, when contribution margins, as we showed a few minutes ago, are high, demand for fertilizer is very high, and that pushes those fertilizer prices higher. We're going to see a reduction in the demand for fertilizer, not just in the U.S., but in many places around the world the next several years. So that's going to be a contributing factor to seeing some lower fertilizer prices. The other side of the fertilizer price equation, of course, is the supply side. That's a little more difficult to get a handle on. But as you look at reductions in the cost of oil, energy is a major input into the fertilizer sector. So I think there's a couple of reasons why we could anticipate seeing some lower fertilizer prices. We've seen a little bit of evidence of that taking place this winter. Nitrogen prices have declined relative to last fall. We're probably going to see some more. But again, that reduction in fertilizer prices is only going to be partially realized here in the spring of 2015. Longer term, we would expect to see more adjustments take place in fertilizer values or fertilizer prices.
Yes, price is probably going to help us out here as we move into 15 and 16. But again, these higher fertilizer cost per bushel or per acre in recent years are also related to amounts. And so when you're thinking about strategies, you need to continually ask yourself, am I using the right amount of N, P, and K on every acre? Is it the optimum amount? And so continually ask yourself that. Am I applying it at the proper times in the most efficient ways? And so it's both amount and price we need to think about when we're trying to control these fertilizer costs.
Let's look at seed cost per bushel.
Seed cost has really increased since 2000. This is not news to anybody. I mean, look at 2000 there. We started at 30 cents per bushel, if not less. Now in 13 and 14, we're above 60 cents per bushel. Obviously, we have higher yields over this period, and so we were buying improved seed to get those higher yields. When you're looking at seed costs, again, you have to be a little bit cognizant of price. Is there some varieties that are a little bit cheaper that would give you similar yields? Constantly ask yourself that, but also think about seeding rates. Am I using the optimum seeding rate? When I mean optimum, I mean the most economically efficient seeding rate. What would happen if I backed off my seeding rate slightly? Would that decrease my yield? And so constantly think in terms of incremental revenue and incremental cost. If I reduce my seeding rate, I'm going to save some money. So that's some incremental revenue, if you will. What's the cost of that? Am I going to lose no bushels? Am I going to lose 5 bushels? And so that's the way to think about controlling seed costs.
So I think this is a good time to make the point that one of the reasons we put these charts on a per bushel of output basis is it captures not only the change in per acre cost, but also any potential changes in output level.
Yes.
And so one of the things you have to be very careful about as you try to monitor your cost and make some improvements or reductions in your cost, it's very important to think about it in terms of cost per unit of output, right? You want to be very careful about implementing cost changes that would result in any yield reductions, right? That's really the key here. And what we really want to focus on, especially here in 2015, is primarily opportunities to reduce cost without reducing yield. And I think if you look at the production practices we've put in place the last 5 or 6 years, many farms have an opportunity to reduce production cost and have little or no impact on yield, and that would result in a lower cost per bushel of output. If the price crunch becomes, or the margin crunch becomes more severe, we might start looking at some changes in costs that actually give us somewhat lower yields. In other words, looking at your margin analysis saying, okay, that additional cost for this input or this additional unit of that input doesn't justify or doesn't provide enough gain in output to make it worth its while, therefore we're going to cut back on it. But in the short run here, I think for a lot of farms, the focus should probably be on, are there ways that I can reduce input cost without impacting yield? And that would wind up giving me a lower cost per bushel of output.
And we should reiterate at this time the importance of calculating these costs in your own farm. Maybe your seed cost is 50 cents per acre, meaning that you're very competitive compared to this case farm.
Yeah.
Maybe it's $1.
Right.
I mean, hopefully it's not $1, but there might be some cases where it is considerably higher than the chart here. And so the important thing is what are your costs compared to these benchmarks?
And one of the keys is by using it on a per bushel basis,
Yes.
you now can look at benchmarks not only from your own community on your own soil types, but compared to your competitors elsewhere in the state, elsewhere in the Corn Belt,
Yes.
elsewhere in the country. And that really is an opportunity to see how efficient you are relative to your competitors, and that's how you become best in class.
Yes.
All right, so let's talk about best in class a little bit in terms of improving your execution on your farm. One of the things you mentioned earlier was using standard operating procedures. You want to talk a little bit about that and how that can improve your cost per bushel of output?
That involves several different things, but one of them is timely operations. I mean, that's certainly important there. But this last point, I think, really gets to it: details, details, details. Does everybody in your operation know how to go about doing something? And that's what we really mean when we talk about standard operating procedures. If it's planting corn, is everybody planting corn the same way? Is that the case? If you're in a livestock operation, is everybody feeding the swine the same way? And so that becomes very important, particularly as you have quite a few employees.
And even truthfully, on a relatively modest-sized operation where there might only be 2 or 3 people, there still can be some issues there. So identifying those standard operating procedures can be very important over longer periods of time in terms of making sure that you're operating as efficiently as possible. And it's something that when I visit with farmers around the country, not very many people have implemented. And as you mentioned, it's more common with firms that have somewhat larger employee numbers. It's a little more common, based on my observation, perhaps in the livestock sector than the crop sector, but it clearly pays. And if you look at industry outside of agriculture, it's been widely implemented and very successful.
Another way to think about this is if we all talk to people that are constantly asking themselves, is there a better way to do X? That's the kind of people, those are the kind of people that have these standard operating procedures. They're constantly asking that question. Am I using the proper seeding rate? Am I efficiently planting that corn? They're constantly asking that question so that they can make improvements.
And I think the other point to make with respect to standard operating procedures is it doesn't have to be, in fact, I would encourage it not to be, an entirely top-down kind of a thing. This is an opportunity to engage employees, to engage other family members, and gather their input with respect to what is the best way to do this, what could we do to become a little more efficient, a little more effective. So it's not a question of the person at the top of the organizational chart, whether it's 2 people or 25 people. It's really a question of doing it more from a team perspective and trying to, as a group, identify the best way to do things. So let's talk a little bit about another element of being best in class, and that's buying things correctly or buying them right. And we would encourage you to really have a procurement mentality. And a lot of larger firms have people that are full-time procurement people. Their job on a day-to-day basis is to acquire the inputs into whatever that particular firm is building or supplying. We think on a farm, most people tend not to do that. They tend not to approach it from quite that level. And we're suggesting it's important, especially now, if you want to be a low-cost producer on a per bushel of output basis, if you want to be best in class, you've got to have that mentality. What's that mean? Well, you've got to start comparing prices and offerings from various suppliers. And I guess I said prices there, but really it's a little more than price. You've got to look at the total package, what that supplier is capable of providing. But you need to shop around a little bit and make sure that you're actually receiving competitive prices and competitive offers from those various suppliers, and make sure that what you're buying is on a competitive basis.
And for some inputs, obviously quality of service is important.
Yeah.
Factor that in. It's not necessarily just price, as Jim indicated, it's also quality of service. If you're having someone do a custom operation on your farm, are they doing it efficiently? Are they doing it timely? That's probably just as important as price sometimes. And so think about that as a package. Is the supplier offering a quality service for a competitive price? And we were talking about yesterday what happened in the swine industry, maybe 20, 25 years ago, where people were really starting to concentrate on bid sheets for specific rations. That's what I think we need to do more in crop agriculture today.
Yeah,
is that mentality.
Yeah, and you're right. We saw that happen in a major way in the livestock sector, especially in swine, over the past couple of decades. And there's an opportunity to do that much more effectively. And using a bid sheet is a great way to do it. That way you ensure that when you're gathering input, gathering prices and service offers from various input suppliers, that they're providing the same, bidding on the same thing, not only the same items, but the same level of service, delivery, terms, etc. So you've got everything kind of standardized. And when you make comparisons, now you're comparing apples to apples, not apples to oranges.
And remember, everything needs to be on a per bushel basis. And so if you're doing seed corn, for example, maybe this is an obvious point, when you're doing seed corn, for example, it doesn't do you any good to buy a hybrid that's a lot cheaper if you're sacrificing a lot of yield. So you have to use some common sense when you're doing this, but sir, you can factor that in with your bid sheets.
And you know, one of the things to think about, especially when we've made this point in previous webinars, when you think about capital items, this is a time frame when you think about, can we do that more cheaply by repairing what we have, perhaps running it through the shop, whether it's an internal shop or perhaps a dealer shop, and repairing it instead of replacing it. That's going to be key. And as we look at a lot of farm management records, historically farms that have been good at that have been farms that have been low-cost producers.
Yes. The machinery ownership was 8%, but if you put in repairs and fuel, that's up to 13%. That's a big cost item, and certainly in today's environment, you know, rather than buying a machine, you need to think about is it going to be a lot cheaper just to repair the machines I have, particularly in the environment we're in, where a lot of farms have bought quite a bit of machinery since 2007. So we're in an environment where some farms probably don't need to buy machinery for a year or two, or at least very much machinery.
But the whole buying right idea is huge because this sets your cost structure, right? It has a huge impact on your total cost per bushel and your variable cost per bushel. So that's really key.
And I don't necessarily want to open this can of worms, but I'm going to anyway, Jim. When you think about buying right, we're also talking about assets. I talked about machinery, the importance of buying right, making sure you need that machine, making sure you're getting a competitive price for that machine. You know, particularly used machinery. Really do your homework when you're buying used machinery. But let's talk about the elephant in the room: land. You know, this is the time now where you need to be cautious about what you pay for land. It's just like I said, cash rents are likely to come down in the next 2-3 years. So are land values. And so you need to even more carefully think about what you're bidding on land in today's environment.
Yeah, I agree, very much so. Let's talk a little bit about another element of best in class, and that's using the best science. Clearly, you know, in other industries you talk about using the best technology, and in our case the best technology is about using the best science that's out there. And there's a tremendous amount of research-based information out there that help us make better decisions. Whether we're talking about fertility and monitoring our NP and K levels very carefully, soil testing is obviously huge. Do you have a really up-to-date soil test? Do you have a good strategy there? Are you routinely soil testing on a timely basis and monitoring what's going on with those P and K levels and perhaps some micronutrients as well? That's huge. Weed control, very important. Lots of opportunities, especially in the current environment, to make some improvements. One of the big challenges right now in much of the country is the advent of resistant weeds. And again, it's important to look at this on a per bushel of output basis, not just a per acre basis, particularly with resistant weeds. We could be looking at some situations where per acre cost actually go up, but that might help us drive down cost per unit of output because of the yield impacts that could be huge if you don't adequately control those resistant weeds. Seed technology, you mentioned a little bit, but one of the things to think about obviously is seeding rate, and then also what technology do you need on the seed side? One of the things that's driven up seed cost in recent years is the combination of effectively pesticides being incorporated into the seed technology along with some weed control technology. Do you need all the technology that seed company is trying to sell you? Evaluate that very carefully, and perhaps, particularly with the advent of the triple stack hybrids, you might conclude in your region, in your county, where you're farming, you might not need all of that technology. That might be a way to reduce your seed cost per bushel of output. Again, be very careful in terms of thinking about the yield impacts, but nevertheless there might be an opportunity there. Fungicides, we've really seen a pretty dramatic increase in the use of fungicides. When you look at the research coming out of not just Purdue but other land-grant universities, it would suggest very strongly that fungicides can be effective in terms of reducing disease and having a positive impact on yield, but only when disease is present. And that means be a pretty aggressive crop scouter. And that actually applies across the board with respect to weed control, et cetera. One of the keys to thinking about becoming more effective and a best-in-class operation is to be a very aggressive crop scouter. Whether you do that individually or perhaps that's a service that you hire out because you want to bring that expertise in. One of the things that I think is important to think about, and this applies really to our buying input strategy that we were talking about, is do you have somebody in your firm who's really in charge of this, and what is their level of technical expertise? What are they doing with respect to professional development in this area? Are they really staying on top of the latest research? And there's a wide variety of ways you can do that. I mean, for example, one would be, is anybody in your farm pursuing a certified crop advisor program? Another one would be, for example, here at Purdue, our Diagnostic Training Center, which is a cooperative venture between several departments here on Purdue, agronomy, botany and plant pathology, entomology, have gone together and put together a diagnostic training center housed here in West Lafayette. They offer workshops all summer long. Tremendous opportunity to improve your technical skill set. Somebody in your farm operation should be on top of that and really make sure you got that technical expertise. If you don't do it that way, you absolutely need to step outside and hire that kind of expertise, because it can be very important in terms of improving your ability to be a low-cost producer.
Let's go back to that slide. I want to make a couple points here, Jim, if I might. You really need to have that technical knowledge if you're going to look at incremental costs and incremental revenue. Because the cost side usually is fairly easy. You know, if you, for example, if you're going to apply fungicide, you know pretty much what that's going to cost you. The hard part is the other side. What is the incremental revenue? Well, in terms of fungicides, you need to know how many bushels per acre higher the yield's going to be because you use that fungicide. And maybe that's an easy example, but when you're looking at seed and fertility, that technical knowledge is so important to estimating incremental revenue, to really figuring out what the impact's going to be on yield. You need that technical expertise. And so having that technical expertise and then asking the question related to incremental revenue and incremental cost is extremely powerful.
Yeah, and one of the keys obviously is with lower revenues, right? Lower prices per bushel of output. Some decisions that in the past might have been optimal are no longer optimal.
Everything has to pay, and you have to ask that question: is everything I'm doing making me enough revenue to justify doing it?
Right.
And so that's why I keep repeating this incremental revenue, incremental cost. I think it's an extremely powerful method. Another point we don't have on this slide, Jim, is you need to think about your cropping system. Is the current cropping system you're using, really the best in terms of your cost per bushel for your different crops? For example, if you've been producing continuous corn, is that the right thing to do here? Not only from a profit standpoint, but also from related to fertility, seed, and fungicide use, and all of these things. And so think about this also in a cropping system framework.
Yeah, exactly. Well, let's take a look at maybe just, we're not going to go through all the different ways you could pursue making yourself a little better up to speed with respect to research-based decision making, but let's look at a couple of things to be pretty straightforward. One, with something like a big input like nitrogen, a lot of research available out there to help you make better decisions. And I've done a screenshot here of something called the Corn Nitrogen Rate Calculator, which is a cooperative venture with several land-grant universities, including Purdue. Iowa State houses this on their website. If you want to find this, all you have to do in a Google search engine or your favorite search engine, just type in the word Corn Nitrogen Rate Calculator and maybe the word Iowa State, but I think Corn Nitrogen Rate Calculator probably gets you there. And you'll get to a screen that looks like this, and it allows you to pick off which state you're in. In the case of Indiana, you've got several choices based on some of the underlying data. Wisconsin, Minnesota, Ohio, Illinois. So you've got lots of opportunities there to localize this a little bit. There's a couple different ways you can use this. I happen to pick the multiple price ratio screen here, so you've got a chance to look at, and the way I did it, this particular screen was several different anhydrous ammonia prices. It calculates the nitrogen price per pound for you, and then you input whatever corn prices you want to look at. And I wanted to look at one corn price as nitrogen rate varied. So that's one way to look at this. And it'll give you several different outputs. I'll show you one screen output from this. But it helps show you what your optimum fertilizer rate is. And so you get a little, that band there suggests that the optimum rate for this particular farm, for the prices we were using, is probably going to be about, well, the maxes out at about 170, but if you stay within that band of about, looks like about 20 pounds or so of nitrogen, you're probably at the optimum. What I would encourage you to think about doing in this environment, a very tight margin environment, is looking at that band. You probably want to be towards the left-hand side of that band, right? That's one way to reduce your cost per bushel of output. There's some uncertainty with respect to yield, so you got to think about that a little bit with respect to your yield target, but nevertheless, be towards the left-hand side of that band, and that's one way to help reduce your cost per bushel.
And partly it depends on how flat the curve is, the yield curve is. The flatter that yield curve, as you get towards the production side, the further left you want to be, because there's no use. At a certain point you may not get any additional yield for your additional costs. And so yes, certainly being toward the left side of that band would make a lot of sense in today's environment. Yeah,
and just to let you know that the data behind that N-rate calculator is data that's been collected from a variety of different research sites in all the states that were listed there. And I was visiting with one of our agronomists yesterday, Jim Camberado. He pointed out that we have a publication on Purdue's website. You can search for that as well using the Google search engine, and we'll put some links on our site as well after this program's over. But really walks you through this decision-making process, and actually I think maybe has some slightly newer data than what's currently on the web. So nevertheless, it helps you make your decision about that nitrogen rate based on science, not guesswork. And I think that's really the key here, is using some science to make those decisions. Here's an example of a website that was developed, again, on a joint basis with a number of different land-grant universities, including Purdue. I think probably virtually all the north central states were involved in this, and probably many states in the south as well. It's a website that was funded by the United Soybean Board, but it pulled in weed scientists from around the country to help people make better choices with respect to their herbicide program, particularly with the idea of managing weed control in an environment that now has become more complex because of the advent of resistant weeds. And what that website, well, there's a lot of different things you can do on this website, and I'll show you the address here in a second, but one of the things it allows you to do is look at the products and the active ingredients. And that gets back to our buying our inputs, right? Because now you can start looking at multiple ways of buying those products, and whether or not one premix with a very comparable weed control, very comparable active ingredient mix might be cheaper per bushel of output than another one. You might look at perhaps buying some of those products with the active ingredients individually and combining them on your own and your own spray system. And it allows you to look at all that in a very straightforward way. In fact, one of the things that I think is really powerful on this website is you can simply type in the trade name. If you look at the bottom of the screen there, you can simply type in the trade name of the product, and it will provide you what are the active ingredients in that product. So you can decipher what's going on there very easily on this website. Conversely, you can type in active ingredients, and it'll provide you some trade name products that contain those active ingredients. So it's a way for you to sort through things. If you don't like using the web tool, Purdue has a publication on the botany and plant pathology website on the weed science side that provides that in more of a tabular format, so you can sort through it individually. I kind of like the web version myself, but either way, it's a way for you to zone in on what you're doing with respect to your weed control program and look for some ways to do things a little bit lower cost than perhaps you have been in the past, and at least rethink your program a little bit and perhaps make some changes going forward. So let's talk about some other elements of best in class. You know, one is just doing fewer things better, right? We talked about standard operating procedures. That's one way to become better. The other thing to just think about is whether or not are you spread too thin? And this probably applies more to farms that have a small labor force, perhaps a 1 or 2 person farm or 1 or 2 or 3 person farm. ask yourself, what do we do better than anyone else? And that's the first thing. You got to identify something where you really are best in class, right? And then perhaps focus and intensify on that one a little bit. And on some things that maybe you're not very good at, you need to think about outsourcing that. And so on some farms, we mentioned crop scouting is really important in terms of optimizing your input usage and reducing potentially reducing your cost per bushel of output. That might be something that if you don't have that expertise, maybe that is something that you outsource, and a number of farms have. Soil testing, do you want to pull the samples yourself, or do you want to outsource that? If you're outsourcing, though, one thing I would encourage you to think about is making sure that you're outsourcing to an independent source, someone that is going to provide unbiased information back to you, somebody that doesn't have a vested interest in selling you a product. I think that's key, and those sources are out there, but I think that is key in terms of looking at one way of doing things a little bit better. Data management can be effective as well, right? So there's a tremendous amount of data we're collecting. The question is, what are you doing with it, right? I think for many farms, we're not perhaps collecting it efficiently. We're not maybe doing a good job of analyzing it. Think about that, right? Are you collecting data just for the heck of it, or are you actually going to use that data to make some better decisions and try and learn a little bit more about your operation and capture some insights about what's going on? But I think you got to be careful about false signals. One of the things in this whole big data area is the risk that we draw inferences that aren't quite supported in a broader sense by the data. And so there's a tendency sometimes to decide what we're looking for and maybe search for data that supports that conclusion, as opposed to looking for some independent research there that would actually help us provide some new insight. So I think that's one of the keys.
A couple points here, Jim, I wanted to make is when you're thinking about records or you're thinking about data, I always talk about the importance of having a good set of whole farm records before you get too excited about your field records. And so kind of start at the top. What does the picture look like from a whole farm standpoint? Balance sheet, income statement, cash flow. Then, as we were indicating, get this cost of production per output. What's my cost of production for corn? What's my cost of production for soybeans? What's my cost of production for my different livestock operations? Once you're comfortable with that, then you're ready for the field level data and start analyzing field by field, optimal decisions. And so that's kind of the order in terms of records that I think you need to keep in mind. One of the things, and we were talking about this this morning with Mike Bulgy before he had to leave. One of the things that makes agriculture so challenging is you only have one crop per year. If you're in a manufacturing business and you're thinking about standard operating procedures, you think about making changes, you're producing that product on a regular basis. And so you can make changes fairly quickly. With agriculture, you're only dealing with one crop per year. So you have one weather event per year, and that's driving your yield. That makes it much more difficult. And that's why the big data can be problematic too, because if you're looking at data for just 1 or 2 years, how much reliance do you want to have on 1 or 2 years of data where the weather pattern might have been very specific to those years? Maybe those years weren't normal. Like 2014, for example, we were talking about that earlier this morning too. We had very good weather in most parts of Indiana. Do you want to do things exactly for a year like that, or you want to apply your inputs for a more typical year?
Good point. So let's think about how we win in tough times, and we've said, be best in class. It's not new, right? We're talking about, in some respects, from a managerial perspective, getting back to the basics. Mm-hmm. And we've been through this before, right? Mm-hmm. Prior to 2005, this is kind of the environment we were living in for a number of years, actually through the 90s, through the first 5 or 6 years of this new millennium. This is really dusting off that old playbook and getting back to some of those strategies. So we're going to deal with tighter margins for the next 5 years or so, it looks like to us. That means we need to think about implementing some changes that actually get us back to that kind of an environment and learning to live with prices that are probably on the low end, maybe around $3.50 or so on corn, maybe a touch below that, but we wouldn't anticipate too much below that. And on the high end, maybe $4, $4.25, something like that. Without a drought coming in, for example. So what can you do to actually manage your farm effectively in that kind of a price environment for corn, and comparable levels on the soybean side and the wheat side? So that's really the focus of our discussion here today. Michael, let's turn to our emails. Looks like we had a question come up from a viewer. Let me pull that up real quick. We had a viewer that said, is irrigation efficiency a factor to consider? His comment was he's not sure how much water cost per bushel might play a role here. And then he's also said, we mentioned aggressive crop scouting. Are drones potentially making that yourself, doing that yourself on your own farm, a little easier? Let's talk about the irrigation efficiency first. I think you've actually did an irrigation meeting here recently.
This is a perfect example of you using your incremental cost and incremental revenue. You know, first of all, you want to factor in what is the cost of the irrigation equipment, the pivot, the pipes. What is the cost of that system? So that's important for the cost side. The other cost, of course, is the water, as you indicate. So what is the cost of the water? What is the cost of the irrigation system? Compare that to your incremental revenue. How many bushels are you getting because you're able to irrigate 6 inches, 9 inches, whatever the case may be? Are you getting enough incremental revenue to pay for those costs? And so this is a case where this, well, I call it marginal analysis, but this incremental analysis is so important. You need to make sure that your irrigation costs are being covered by the additional revenue. Of course, with irrigation in Indiana, many times you also have to factor in incremental revenue from producing something like seed corn. It might not just be commercial corn, and so that would be part of your incremental revenue calculation. But so this is a classic case where the incremental revenue, incremental cost is very important. If we look at drones, I think that I'm very excited about that technology. We've probably got a ways to go yet before those are going to be standard operating procedures, but I think it has a lot of potential.
It has a lot of potential, but as you think about 2015 and maybe 2016, I don't see usage of drones replacing crop scouting. You look out farther into the future, clearly we're going to see some changes take place there. But right now we probably don't have enough information to make that determination. But if you're looking at the use of a drone, most of those have gotten to the point where they're not that expensive at the moment. A couple of years ago they were very expensive. Now the cost has come down. So it might be an opportunity to learn some things. It might be a way to augment an existing crop scouting system. I don't think we're at the stage where it's going to replace crop scouting here in the next year or two.
With most technologies, you have a testing phase, and I would argue that we're still in the testing phase.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Once that testing phase gets a little further here, then I think it's going to become more common.
Yeah. So I guess as we wrap up here, Michael, a couple of things to think about. One is visit our website. We're going to have access to obviously a recorded version of this webinar if you want to review some of that here at a later date. The second thing is we've got another couple of webinars coming up. We've got a webinar coming up on the 16th of February, which is a Monday, I believe. Is that correct? I think that's right. But the 16th of February, and we're going to focus on the farm program on that one. We did a webinar on farm programs back in early December. A few things have changed a little bit since then. We're going to revisit that on the 16th of February. We know a lot of you have not made your final decisions yet, particularly with respect to electing a program. In some cases, maybe not with respect to even updating yields and updating or reallocating base acreages. But so we'll do that on the 16th of February. Hopefully you'll find that helpful and as you make your final decisions on the farm program. And then on the, help me out here, was it the 1st of March?
March 2nd?
March 2nd. March 2nd, we're going to have another webinar. And the focus of that webinar is probably going to be primarily on crop insurance decisions. Most of us in the Corn Belt have to make a crop insurance decision by the middle of March. So we'll have all the data from the month of February on that 2nd of March, and we'll be able to help you, guide you a little bit with respect to your crop insurance decisions here for 2015.
And the big focus on the crop insurance is going to be revenue guarantees. How do I pick my coverage level given that the revenue guarantee is likely to be lower than it has been for several years? And so that'll be a big part of that discussion, picking the proper coverage level. But we'll also talk about how crop insurance ties into the Farm Bill.
Yeah. So join us for those webinars. We also have a host of other information, especially on the Farm Bill. I guess I want to point out that if you go to our website, we do have an entire page with a lot of different resources with respect to the Farm Bill resources and decision-making process. If you go to our website and you simply look at the resources and tools, you click on that, and one of the options in there is farm policy. And if you click on that, I think you'll find a series of fact sheets. You'll find direct access to our webinar that we recorded on the Farm Bill back in December, and some other information out there as well. So if you're looking for some information on the Farm Bill, that'd be a good place to visit. And with that, I'm going to wrap it up for today. We appreciate you joining us. We look forward to having you join us on future webinars, and as it indicates on our screen there, you can visit our website by simply typing Center for Commercial Ag in our search engine. So thanks for joining us this morning, and have a good day.